Once there was a time when nothing big could happen in America without Will Rogers being summoned to the scene to make it official. Bands might play, flags fly, orators sound off, but it wasn't really an event unless Will showed up and made a joke about it. That tremendous political rally in Hollywood back in '32, for instance, that was an event. Being Hollywood, of course, they made a super colossal production on it. Will Rogers wasn't billed as the star of that show, but he sure broke up the man who was.
We must have some 80 or 90,000 people here tonight. That's the most people that ever paid to see a politician. Now, here tonight, Governor, you're not allowed to refer to politics. They won't let anyone talk politics in here because this stadium was dedicated to art, sports, and any useful enterprises. Now, Franklin, I can call you Franklin, and because I've known you for many years. You used to come to the Follies as a boy and see our show. In fact, you come there as an old man to see it, too.
Now, this introduction hasn't been very, well, you know, it hasn't been perhaps very learned or very flowery, but remember, you're only a candidate. As a president, I'll do right by you. And because I'm certainly wasting no oratory on a prospect.
Wherever he went, and he went everywhere, he was greeted by swarms of total strangers who thought of him as an old friend. They regarded Will as their own court jester at large, a spokesman for the plain people who was unawed by potentates or presidents. Presidents, why, he was famous for kidding them, and face to face, too. At the opening of the Coolidge Dam in Arizona, it was Cal Coolidge himself, sometimes known as the Great Stoneface, who got a generous sample of the Rogers ribbing.
I was invited here by the governor, and I got to the bridge, and the fellow said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, here's the one trying to get in here. They say they're going to eat." And you can't go in there. You got to have a badge. And I couldn't get in. I went back up here and filled up on hot dogs. So I didn't eat here today, and if I'm rotten, I don't owe you anything. I'm here as a Democrat to offset Mr. Coolidge. In fact, Mr. Coolidge is the best Democrat we ever had in the White House, anyhow. He really is. He did us more good. He did a lot of good. He was just the man we needed. He didn't do nothing, but that's what we want done.
And on radio, he was just as sassy and freewheeling, and when it was Will Rogers' time, everybody tuned in. Will would have fun with commercials, international affairs, and President Hoover all in the same broadcast.
Now, don't get scared and start turning off your radios. I'm not advertising or trying to sell you anything. If the mouthwash you're using is not the right kind and it tastes sort of like sheep dip, why, you just have to go right on using it. I can't advise any other kind at all. Now, Mr. Owen Young asked me to annoy on this program this evening. You all know Mr. Owen D. Young, you know. He's the only sole surviving wealthy Democrat. He started the Young Plan in Europe. That was that every nation pay just according to what they could afford to pay, see? And, well, somebody else come along with an older plan than Young's plan, and it was that nobody don't pay anybody anything. And, of course, that's the oldest plan there is. And that's the one they're working under now. That's why we ain't getting anything from Europe. So when Mr. Young asked me to appear. Why, I said, well, I'm kind of particular. I said, who's going to be the other speaker? Who else is on the bill with me? And he said, well, how would Mr. Hoover do? Well, I slightly heard of him, you know, and I said, well, I'll think it over. So I looked into Mr. Hoover's record and inquired of everybody. And after I had kind of thrown out about 2/3 of what the Democrats said about him, why, I figured that I wouldn't have much to lose by appearing with Mr. Hoover. So I'm here this evening appearing on the bill with Mr. Hoover. So now I expect you won't hear any more of Amos and Andy. It'll just be Hoover and Rogers from now on.
He was big on radio, all right, and he was bigger in the movies. Audiences loved him there, and for the same reason. He was a natural. He was always natural. The thing about Will's acting was that he was just the same on screen as off. For instance, there was that famous scene of Will applying for a passport.
You say you were born in the Indian Territory, and at that time they had no such thing as birth certificates? Then how are we to know of your birth?
Kind of gather from you that you doubt I was born. Of course, out in our country, if you walk up and appear before anybody in person, why, we take it as fairly positive proof that you must have been born. We just kind of trust in that way. We might wonder as to why born, but we never will question the fact that you was born.
But you must have some witnesses to your birth.
Witness to my birth? See, out home, this thing being born, that was kind of a private affair. It wasn't a public function by any means.
But you are an American citizen.
Well, I think I am. Folks, Indians, both my mother and father had Cherokee blood, you know. Born and raised in Indian Territory. Of course, I'm not these Americans whose ancestors come over on the Mayflower, but we met them at the boat when they landed. And it's always been to the everlasting discredit of the Indian race that we ever let them land.
Will wasn't just kidding about his Indian ancestry. He was born in 1879 at a place called Oologah, when this was still Indian Territory. Later on, it became the state of Oklahoma. His father, Clem Rogers, was an official of the Cherokee Nation and became one of the most influential citizens of the town of Claremore, Oklahoma. The family's Indian strain showed clearly in Will's grandma Shrimshire, but there was Irish, Welsh, and English blood in the line, too. Young Will was quite a mixture, but he couldn't have been more American. He was sent to a military school where he didn't do very well. Will was always more interested in sports and horseplay than in study. Afterwards, he said, I spent 10 years in the 4th grade and knew more about McGuffey's Fourth Reader than McGuffey did. But when it came to country-style socializing, Will got better than passing marks and grew up to be quite the gay young blade. 7 lovely sisters from Arkansas, the Blake girls, were among his youthful companions. The one Will chose was Betty, who later became his wife. When I roped her, that was the star performance of my life. He was a restless, uncertain young man who didn't quite know what to make of himself. One thing he did know, he loved riding and roping above everything else. So he left home and became a cowboy in Texas, in the Argentine, and South Africa. And years later, he would write, there's no greater, no happier life in the world than that of a cattleman. The Wild West shows of those days offered a wandering cowboy a chance to ride and rope without the monotony of the trail. And Will joined up with Texas Jack's Wild West Circus. I get $20 a week, he wrote home, and sleeping cars to sleep in, though I have to pay for my meals, which are very dear at 75 cents a meal. But anyway, Will Rogers was now in show business. Will got to be what he called a regular Wild Wester. He even got himself a new name, the Cherokee Kid. I ride those broncs with paws in the air, feet free and a scratching, he said. But good as he was at rough riding, that wasn't his real specialty. He had another, and it was going to make him famous. From boyhood on, Will had a passion for the lariat. He practiced day and night to perfect his skill with it, and they began calling him the roping fool. He could do the whole saddlebag of roping trips, the Texas skip, the ocean wave, the dotty blocker. Texas Jack himself called Will Rogers the champion lasso thrower of the world. And no wonder. Spinning a rope is fun, Will used to say, providing your neck ain't in it. The time came, though, when he did more than just jump through a lariat. He jumped right out of the rodeos and Wild West shows and onto the vaudeville stage. By 1907, Will Rogers was a popular stage performer at home and abroad. Just by chance, he introduced casual jokes into his act, and soon his lingo began to eclipse his lasso. The jokes got bigger and bigger billing, and so did Will. He wasn't just the Cherokee Kid anymore. He was the droll cowboy. He was a headliner. He made it to Broadway, and he made it big, with Florence Ziegfeld, producer of the most glittering and glamorous shows that Broadway had ever seen. The smart set of New York came swarming in to see and hear Will Rogers, the Oklahoma cowhand, who had made one of the longest leaps in show business, all the way from the arena of Texas Jack's Wild West Circus to the stage of the Ziegfeld Follies. Glorifying the American girl, that was the slogan of the Follies. But now, Will said, you can't see the American girl being glorified without being annoyed by a jarring presence among them, which I am free to admit as myself. But the truth was that Will Rogers quickly became one of the biggest of all the Follies stars, which included such great performers as the fabulous Fanny Brice and Marilyn Miller, the dancing darling of a dazzling dozen hits. Classic comedians like the great W.C. Fields, and old banjo eyes, Eddie Cantor. Will himself became famous for kidding not only the customers beyond the footlights, but the cuties behind them. He used to say, isn't it sad to think that in 20 years all these lovely creatures will be 5 years older? Amid all the girls and all the glitter, Will Rogers kept his earthy touch, almost as if he weren't on Broadway at all, but still back home in Oklahoma. The surroundings were glamorous, but Will wasn't. He chewed gum, used bad grammar, and joked irreverently about the topics of the day. The show stayed pretty much the same, but Will's humor was fresh and new every night. There were always plenty of pretty girls in the Follies, but there was only one Will Rogers. The thing that set Will Rogers apart from other comedians of his time was his constant search for fresh material among the people and happenings around him. His favorite saying was, "All I know is what I read in the papers." And in the spring of 1917, there was plenty to read, mostly about the war in Europe. We got in it all right, unprepared as usual. Will Rogers had his say about that, too. There is some talk of getting a machine gun if we can borrow one, he said. The one we have now they're using to train our army with in Plattsburgh. If this war keeps on, we'll just about have to go to the trouble of getting another gun. But Will also said, Germany wonders how we can train our soldiers so quick. That's because we only train them to go one way. There's nothing in our manual about retreating. President Wilson liked that joke, and when he publicly referred to Will Rogers as one of our American humorists, Will was mighty proud. Up to then, I'd only been an ordinary rope thrower, he said. Woodrow Wilson was the first president Will ever made laugh. And when the war was over and the president left for Europe to attend the peace negotiations, Will Rogers was, as usual, skeptical. History shows, he said, that the United States never lost a war or won a conference. But we did win the war, and the bands played When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and the celebration was on. Once again, naturally, Will Rogers had his own slant on the situation. If they really want to honor the boys, he asked, why don't they let them sit in the stands and have the people march by? It was quite a party, that armistice jag after World War I, but it was nothing to the all-American binge that was coming up. The national insanity came in with Prohibition, and when the jazz age got to jumping, every night was New Year's Eve. Will Rogers cast his country boy eye on it all and said, in any American crowd these days, you can always pick out the bootlegger. He's the one that's sober. This would be a great world to dance in, said Will, if we didn't have to pay the fiddler. The wild, boozy, spending splurge of the 20s didn't fool him. This country is not prosperous, he said at the time. Wall Street is in good shape, but 8th Avenue is never as bad off. Big money, and the big shots of gangland out to get it. A new kind of warfare in America, gang warfare. The biggest headlines were no longer being made by heroes, but by outlaws like John Dillinger. Will Rogers himself interviewed the king of the racketeers, Chicago's Al Capone. And Will reported, there was absolutely no way I could write it and not make a hero out of him. What's the matter with an age when our biggest gangster is our greatest national interest? But the big normal majority, as Will Rogers called them, went right on living their lives untouched by the frenzy of the jazz age. His own family and neighbors out in Oklahoma, and folks liked him everywhere. Will had become their spokesman, the country boy conscience of his time. And then through the silent movies, he became nationally known as a traditional American type, the shrewd but lovable hayseed. Hollywood called him the hickiest fellow you ever saw. In those days, the big climax always came with the inevitable scene of somebody chasing madly after somebody else. Will made dozens of those slapstick two-reelers. As long as he could ride like this, who cared whether he could act? say that movies were the only business where you could go out front and applaud yourself. But not enough people were applauding him in the silence, and he was, in fact, pretty much of a failure. But then something big happened to the moving pictures and to Will Rogers. When pictures began to talk, it finished many a silent star, but with Will, well, just the opposite happened. From a silent failure, he became a talking success, and a whole new career opened up. He was a hit from the start. In They Had to See Paris, his first talkie, he played a small-town Oklahoman who struck it rich in oil and was sampling the high life on the continent. He didn't enjoy it much until he met a nightclub singer in the person of Fifi Dorsey at a sidewalk cafe.
You know, I was getting kind of lonesome when you come along here.
Oh, I do not like to see you lonesome.
Garçon!
I see you already speak our language.
S'il vous plaît, merci, n'est-ce pas?
Oh, la la.
Mon Dieu. I gotta cut it out, though. It's interfering with my English.
Vraiment?
Oh,
Moi, petit man de rien, feras tout comme moi.
yeah. And a glass of beer.
Never make my eyes go cuckoo, but I could do it for you. I would never warm up like a Zulu, but I could do it for you. I jump for joy if you could kiss me right now. Boy, would I return it and how? Oh mon chéri, mon chouchou, mon loulou, viens nous prenne-moi, prends-moi d'eau, embrasse-moi donc comme ça tient. I know that I've never felt like going cuckoo, but I would do it for you.
He'd come a long way from Oolaga, Indian Territory, and he was living like the Hollywood royalty he was, the star of a long string of box office hits. David Harum, a Connecticut Yankee, State Fair. He was still a horseman at heart, but now the old pony boy was doing his riding in his own polo field. He had his own stables, too, and a horse for each of the three Rogers children, Mary, Jim, and Will Jr. He taught them some of his riding tricks, and whenever he was home from his travel and lectures, he kept the kids hopping. Will always liked to keep things moving. Just to keep the cowboy touch amid all the luxury, Will had a log bunkhouse built on his Santa Monica estate. And just to keep the Ziegfeld touch, there was a theater in the basement where the kids followed in Daddy's footlights. Just for Mother and the kids, the old Follies routine, complete with chewing gum, lariat, and jokes. I'll tell you what, he'd say, acting is just like getting drunk. If you've got to do it, why, it's better to do it at home. I'm entirely different from the other movie stars, Will used to say. I still got the wife I started out with. And Betty herself mentioned another difference. Will's picture career was never discussed at the dinner table. The newspaper column he was now writing meant more to him than any movie. All I know is what I read in the papers. That had been his slogan for years, and it was the basis for the stream of quips and comment that delighted all America. In 500 newspapers with 40 million readers, Will Rogers' daily column became a national institution. He spent hours wringing a folksy but penetrative paragraph out of the increasing complicated news of his I use only one set method in my little gags, and that is to try to keep to the truth. Of course, you can exaggerate, but what you say must be based on truth. When I knock around, my newspaper stuff gets better, Will used to say. The same wanderlust that caused him to rove the ranges of his youth now took him around the wide, wide world, seeking new people and places to write about. He got to be known as America's self-made diplomat and unofficial ambassador at large. He was right at home in London town. He had performed for King Edward VII and became acquainted with the Prince of Wales, and the renowned Lady Astor was a warm friend of his. Parliament impressed him, but some other things didn't. He said, "England has the best statesmen and the worst coffee of any country in the world." Wherever he went, he turned his trip into a goodwill mission from America. One of his most quoted remarks was, "I never met a man I didn't like. The feeling was always mutual." Nobody who met Will Rogers failed to like him. Whether it was in Dublin, Devonshire, or Dusseldorf, Will just naturally made friends everywhere among old and young alike. Will cable back from Europe were shrewd and sometimes impertinent, but he never claimed to be a pundit. I've got no philosophy. I don't know what the word means, but I'm going to call him like I see him. He wanted to be known as the first flying reporter, and he was especially anxious to see the Soviet Union, which he called the greatest experiment in the world, outside of us. The Russian experiment was in its early stages when Will Rogers arrived to size it up in the mid-20s. He wrote a joking book about it called "There's Not a Bathing Suit in Russia and Other Bare Facts." But he wasn't fooled by the communist system and how it worked. He had it pegged from the start. And he told his American readers, "It seems the whole idea of communism, or whatever they want to call it, is based on propaganda and blood. Russia is starving her own people to feed propaganda to the world." "You can ask a Russian any question in the world," Will reported, "and if you give him long enough, he'll explain their angle and it will sound plausible. Communism to me is 1/3 practice and 2/3 explanation." Later in a radio broadcast, Will reported one of his most surprising discoveries about the Soviet Union. He said, "If you want to get away from communism, as we know communism in America, why, you go to Russia. You know, a communist, he can't get far in Russia. There isn't a single agitator in the whole country. Not a soul trying to plot a strike or tell somebody what to do with their job. The Soviet government, it may be wrong, but no man is going to stand up in a soapbox, either publicly or privately, and announce the fact about it. Over there, your criticism is your epitaph." And Will Rogers came away from Russia with a timely warning for America. Those people, he said, are going somewhere, and we better watch out while they're on their way. Whenever he returned from one of his innumerable trips abroad, the ship news reporters swarmed around to interview him. No humorist since Mark Twain rated such flattering attention from the press, and Will was always ready with a quotable quip for the next edition.
I've been away for 11 weeks, and America may be a wonderful country, but it don't mean nothing to the rest of the world. There's no news anywhere. There ain't a thing, and I don't know a thing that's happened, and Mr. Hoover, now listen, don't let him knock Mr. Hoover too much. Just let him go see some of these other countries and come back. He looks good after you've been over there, brother.
Did you land in Cairo?
Oh, landed in Cairo, yeah. But didn't see the Sphinx. I had already seen Mr. Coolidge.
You had the true that you piloted a plane in China, or did you?
No, I flew with a Chinese pilot. Now that's the last word in heroism. There you go. I see that they called it off. Good boy. Hey, you're gonna get me in. You got it up, Bobby. Let's go home. Oh boy, it's good to get home.
But even when he was home, he seldom stayed put for very long. Flying was his passion. He was a pioneer air passenger at a time when aviation was considered pretty risky, if not downright foolhardy. His first flight really scared him. Here I was, thousands of feet up in the air when you can't even get me to ride a tall horse. But Will Rogers clocked more than 500,000 miles in the air and was one of the few private citizens permitted to fly in government mail planes. Flying is not a fad, it's a necessity, he insisted. And he openly criticized the attitude of the Army and Navy toward aviation. They've always belittled the airplane, he said, and will keep on doing it until they have something dropped on them from one. Will was always a staunch supporter of General Billy Mitchell, whose stubborn battle for American air power got him court-martialed. Famous flyers like Amelia Earhart and Ruth Elder were his friends, and nobody was more thrilled than Will Rogers by Charles A. Lindbergh's historic solo flight to Paris in 1927. Lindbergh said Will is the one man in the world that I would stand on the soapbox in the corner to get a peek at. Will Rogers didn't fly only for fun and excitement. He was constantly taken to the air on missions of mercy. And whenever there was trouble in the land, he headed for the spot the quickest way he could get there. They used to say that he beat the Red Cross to the scene of every disaster. He gave the country an eyewitness report on the Mississippi Valley floods in the mid-20s. I flew all over the whole district, could only see the tops of the houses. There's hundreds of thousands of people down there being driven from their homes, homes that won't be there when they get back. He raised huge sums of money for their relief. With the 30s came new kinds of calamities. It was a time of troubles for America, drought, dust storms, and beyond the grim horizon, the clouds of another kind of storm were gathering, depression. Once more, Will Rogers gave his readers an eyewitness account. I flew through these dust storms with a pilot flying entirely by instruments. It looks like Colorado may blow over and light on top of Kansas. In the Middle West now, you've got to put your brand on your soil, then in the spring go on a roundup looking for it. But it's no joke. It's a terrible thing. Of course, Will Rogers came to help. Those were times when people said of him, he brought more than food and money. He brought cheer and courage. It bucked up everybody to know Will Rogers is here. Relief came to be the big word in America. Relief for flood victims, relief for Dust Bowl victims, relief for the growing number of unemployed and their families. We've heard a lot about prohibition, Will Rogers said. Well, that's nothing to compare to your neighbor's children that are hungry. A few years ago, we were so afraid that the poor people were liable to take a drink, and now we've fixed it so that they can't even get something to eat. The jobless were peddling surplus apples on the corners, or walking the streets, or just sitting in the parks wondering what to do when there was nothing to do. And Will Rogers was saying, there's not really but one problem before the whole country at this time. It's not balancing the budget. It's not the silver question or the League of Nations. It's 7 million people out of work. That's our only problem. And millions listened in October of 1931 when Will Rogers made his memorable broadcast as spokesman for the underdog in an hour of national crisis.
Here we are in a country with more wheat and more corn, and more money in the bank, and more cotton, more everything in the world. There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had in the face of the earth. And yet we've got people starving. We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile. The potter's field are lined with granaries full of grain. Now, if there ain't something cockeyed in an arrangement like that, then this microphone here in front of me is, well, it's a cuspidor, that's all. These people that you're asked to aid, why, they're not asking for charity. They're naturally asking for a job. But if you can't give them a job, why, the next best thing you can do is see that they have food and the necessities of life. You know, there's not one of us that has anything, but these people that are without it now haven't contributed to what we've got. I don't suppose there's the most unemployed, the hungriest man in America has contributed in some way to the wealth of every millionaire in America. It wasn't the working class that brought this condition on at all. It was the big boys themselves who thought that this financial drunk we were going through was going to last forever. They over-merged and over-capitalized and over everything else. That's the fix that we're in now. Doggone it, the people are liberal. Our Americans, I don't know about America being fundamentally sound and all that after-dinner hooey, but I do know that America is fundamentally liberal. Now, I want to thank Mr. Gifford, the head of this unemployment, thank Mr. Young, and I certainly want to thank Mr. Hoover for the privilege of being allowed to appear on the same program with him, because I know that this subject is very dear to Mr. Hoover's heart. I know that he'd rather see the problem of unemployment solved than he would to see all the other problems he has before him combined. And if every town, every city will get out and raise their quota, what they need for this winter, why, it'll make him a very happy man. And happiness hasn't been a steady diet with our president. He's had a very tough, uphill fight. And this will make him feel very good. And he's a very human man. I thank you. Good night.
The country hasn't got down to where it needs a professional comedian for president, said Will, when his name was proposed at 2 national conventions. He preferred staying on the sidelines as the country's saltiest observer of the great American political circus. Our national conventions, he said, are nothing but glorified Mickey Mouse cartoons and are solely for amusement purposes. It takes a great country to stand a thing like that, hitting it every 4 years. No nation likes noise and hooey like we do. We are cuckoo, but we are happy. There's something about a Republican that you can only stand him just so long. And on the other hand, there's something about a Democrat that you can't stand him quite that long. I haven't hardly any politics, he said, but of course I do belong to the Democratic Party. Even the best of us has to let a little cussedness come out now and then. I don't make jokes, Will like to say. I just watch politics and report the facts. After every presidential election, he said, the promising season ends and the alibi season opens. It lasts for the next 4 years. Every politician always talks about Abraham Lincoln, but I notice that none of them ever imitates him. The next morning after an election, people don't come around and say, did you conduct a clean, dignified campaign? No, sir. They just come around and say, boy, did you win? That's politics in a nutshell. Though Will Rogers never held any higher public office than mayor of Beverly Hills, he became a bigger figure on the Washington scene than many a congressman. And when some of his remarks were read into the congressional record, he told his radio audience just how he felt about it.
That's the highest praise that a humorist can have, is to get your stuff into congressional record. Just think my name will be right in there alongside all those other big humorists. And you see, ordinarily, you got to work your way up as a humorist and first get into Congress. And then you work on up into the Senate, and then if your stuff is funny enough, it goes into the congressional record. But for an outsider to get in there as a humorist without having served his apprenticeship in either the House or the Senate, well, that, I'm not bragging, but by golly, I feel pretty big about it. Compared to them, I'm an amateur. And the thing about my jokes is they don't hurt anybody. You can take them or leave them. You know what I mean? You know, you say, well, they're not funny, or they're terrible, or they're good, or whatever it is, but they don't do any harm. You can just pass them by. But with Congress, every time they make a joke, it's a law. You know, and every time they make a law, it's a joke.
But every so often, the old roving cowboy had to get away from it all. Lord, he said, I've looked at enough badges and listened to enough speeches. I'm just tired of seeing history being made. I'm crazy to go to Alaska. That's one place I've never been. I'd like to go when those old boys are all snowed in and I can sit around and hear them tell some of those old tales. I bet they can tell some good ones. His pilot would be Wiley Post, Will's warm friend and fellow Oklahoman. The loss of an eye had not kept Wiley Post from becoming one of the great aviators of his time. Speed flyer, endurance flyer, a pathfinder of the skies. Will Rogers called him just about the king of them all. Rogers explained that the idea of the flight was to explore Wiley's plan for a new mail and passenger route. But as far as Will himself was concerned, I'm off on a little sightseeing trip. I never did get further north up this way than about a block above Main Street, Seattle, he said. But pretty soon he was sending back his column from Alaskan datelines and writing, "We're going to Skagway now and see the famous Chilkoot Pass. We'll do it in 10 minutes, and it took the pioneers 2 and 3 months. Nothing I've ever seen is more beautiful than this inland passage to Alaska." Talk about navigating. There's millions of channels and islands and bays that all look alike to me, Will reported. But old Wiley turns up the right alley every time. At one of their stops, Will was asked, "Aren't you a little scared about flying over such desolate country?" Will's answer was, "Not with Wiley Post. He's the most careful pilot I ever knew." Even in the out-of-way settlements like Matanuska, Will Rogers was recognized. "Anybody here from Claremore?" he would ask. "You folks got a mighty nice place here." Old Wiley had to duck his head to keep from bumping it as we flew under the Arctic Circle. But then clouds began closing in. On August the 15th, 1935, they were heading for Point Barrow. The weather had been bad, foggy and misty, before their takeoff from Fairbanks. But Wiley didn't like waiting. "I think we can make it," he said. "Well," said Will Rogers, "if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me." And the little plane disappeared into the fog and mist. They were only 10 short minutes from their destination when it happened. Eskimos in a lonely sealing camp witnessed the crash and brought the bodies in whale boats to Barrow. And when the word was flashed to the world, "Will Rogers is dead," it was like the announcement of a national disaster. The War Department itself was ordered to escort the bodies on their long journey home. And in Washington, a spokesman voiced the feelings of the whole country when he said, "We are sad today, millions of us." And it was also said of him, "About once in every 50 years, a personality is developed on the American scene whose qualities of mind and heart make such an impression upon us that most of our people in every walk of life generate an affection for him. Such a man was Will Rogers. Now he was gone." The funerals of Wiley Post and Will Rogers were held at the same hour. Wiley's in Oklahoma and Will's in his adopted Los Angeles. The outpouring of public grief was called the greatest since the death of Lincoln. Congress suspended activity in tribute. Flags were flown at half-mast, and in Claremore, the whole town went into mourning. Why did so many thousands who never met Will Rogers weep openly at his passing? Will's fellow actor, Fred Stone, explained it best. "He gave so much of himself to everybody that you didn't have to know him personally to say with great truth, 'I'm a friend of Will Rogers.'" But of all the many, many tributes paid him, none would have made the old flying cowboy prouder than this soaring salute to his memory from a squadron of airmen who would never forget him. Today, more than a quarter of a century since his death, the nation that loved him continues to honor him. In Washington, in the Capitol building, there's a national shrine called Statuary Hall. There, great ones of American history are immortalized: Daniel Webster, Sam Houston, Robert Fulton, and Andrew Jackson. One and only one humorist stands among them. His name is Will Rogers. The reason they built monuments to him was best expressed by his old friend Lady Astor, who spoke for millions when she said, "This was no ordinary man. Underneath all his fun, there was wisdom and common sense and a love that moved mountains." But perhaps the poet Ogden Nash put it more in Will's own style. "I worked with gum and grin and lariat to entertain the proletariat, and with my Oklahomely wit, I brighten up the earth a bit."